We're a unique podcast for families of faith, produced by parents and pastors who understand and appreciate how hard it is to maintain your faith in a hostile culture. We're here to encourage and support you in the most vital role of all, parenting. If you're feeling overwhelmed and afraid, it's okay. You're not alone. Brilliantly Brave is hosted by two honest and engaging dads with 9 kids between them. A road tripper, author, and pastor, Father Brad Matthias, and iShine founder, solo parenting expert, and all-around foodie, Mr. Robert Beeson. Join us each week as we explore and engage with some of the most intriguing, inspiring, outrageous, and awesome parents in the world. This is Brilliantly Brave.
Welcome to Brilliantly Brave Parenting. I'm your host, Pastor Brad Matthias, and I'm here with my sidekick, Robert Beeson.
Hey, and thanks for that.
Yeah, sidekick. Robert is like one of the most creative geniuses in Nashville. I don't know if people in our audience know that, but he's also my partner at iShine and an author himself. He's a prolific creator, and it's through Robert that our guest today was introduced to the show. And he brought to me this summer a friend of his that helped him in a writing endeavor. And this author was a pastor as well as a friend to Robert. And he brought to my attention this idea that there's someone out there who is prolific in a variety of different topics, an expert, if you will, of all things church related. And so I was excited to meet this man. And when I did, I found a kindred spirit, and I immediately thought of him for this podcast. And so before I introduce our guest today, I just want you to know he's written like over 50 books. I think
it's more like 75.
Isn't it? So he's 75 books. This is not a guy who casually writes. This is a serious writer.
Yep.
He's been in the church. He's been a parent. He's been around the block, as they say. And so I really like his sort of pragmatic style.
Right.
Like he doesn't fluff it.
And he's been a pastor as well as a parent himself. And so he has a very, very well-rounded view of parenting as it relates to the church, and especially from a Christian perspective. And as we talk about on this podcast, a post-Christian perspective.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that. And one of the things that I love about him is that he'll sort of call a spade a spade.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he just calls it out. Like, okay, that's...
Or if you're writing with him, he'll just say, no, that sucks. You can't say that. I'm just kidding. He doesn't say it.
Well, I mean, just in the conversations I've had with him over the last few months, I've noticed that there is an alignment of thinking between you and I and this guest. And so, a lot of the opinions that are expressed on Brilliantly Brave are sort of the guest's own opinion. In this case, I'm going to go out on a limb and say we most likely are going to heartily agree with this guest today. And so without any further ado, I want to introduce our friend and fellow author, Robert Noland.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
It's great to have you here.
It's time. It's time for you to join us in the podcast world. And as we prep for this interview today, you mentioned several different topics that God had put on your heart. And instead of me just questioning you, because you are an author with so much background, I'm going to let you lead to us what you think maybe our audience needs to hear.
Well, I think I would start off by saying that my focal ministry is men's ministry and has been since 2009, and going out and speaking, doing conferences, things like that. The very first thing I say in any men's event that I speak at or my own conference is whenever anyone looks at someone up on a stage or they hear someone on a podcast or whatever, we immediately assume they're getting to do that. They're in that platform because they're an expert. And the first thing that I always say is, gentlemen, I am no expert. Just ask my wife. She can back me up on that. And I would say that as far as parenting goes, the only experts that I've ever met are single people who have no children. That tends to be the best expert because they tell you exactly how they're going to do it, and it's always a perfect world, and this is exactly how we're going to do it. And then meet them when they have a 2-year-old screaming running around the house, and you'll see that, well, that didn't work very long. So, but I do think that one of the things we can decide on, and as early as you do this, it's good, is just to say, you know what, I'm not an expert on parenting, I'm not an expert on childhood development, but I can become an expert on my child. And then you can become an expert on every one of your children. Now, it doesn't mean you always know exactly what to do. That's another thing, is we're not always going to know that. But Jesus does, and so that's why it's great to involve him in your parenting, because he does know what to do. But I think learning your kids individually, becoming experts on their behaviors, on their personalities, their needs, their wants. And one of the things we see a lot is a parent will develop a style, and they'll say, "This is my parenting style." And then they'll try to blanket that on every child. And that just doesn't work any more than if you're an employer, you know that your employees don't respond to everything in the same way. If you're a pastor, you know that all your people in your church don't respond exactly the same way whenever you do something, or you teach something or whatever. It's the same thing with your kids. They're going to have different responses. They're going to have different needs and desires and wants, and we have to allow for that. And so I really believe in custom ministry, not compromising ministry. I think there's a difference. I think if you have a value, you have a principle, stick to it and don't compromise it. But you've got to customize those things to your kids.
Well, I think that's a great distinction.
Yeah,
not
absolutely.
being like, you can be a parenting expert, and or a lot of people claim too that they have books about being a parenting expert.
Sure.
But
And some are.
Sure, but I think what I'm hearing you say, and that I think is an incredible distinction, is you can become an expert on your specific child. In fact, it would be to the detriment of the family if you thought the pursuit was just being a blanket parenting expert.
Exactly.
So in your home, some practical idea. How did you become an expert specifically on your sons?
Well, my sons would probably argue that I'm an expert on them, first of all. But I have two adult sons, one that's 26 and one that's 22 now. And so, but they still look to me to be dad and everything in their lives, and come to me with various things. And I think early on, you began to see that, first of all, we had two, and they were extremely different. One was mostly me with a little of mom. The other one was mostly mom as far as personality with a little of me. And so you see all this mixture in there, but they would respond completely different. Our first child was an introvert. Second child was an extrovert. Expecting them to act the same always was just not even possible. Demanding the same thing out of the second child that we demanded out of the first child, and vice versa, just didn't work. And so we just quickly began to see, okay, in order to parent these guys the way the Lord would. And you think about it, when he was dealing with his disciples, and you read the Gospels, he dealt differently with different disciples. He challenged them on different levels. Same thing with one. With our kids, is we just learn that how they're disciplined, how they're challenged, how we communicate to them, how long we communicate to them, how much we reason with them. All of those things are really, really valid. And our second child, who's the extrovert, who just always happy, never met a stranger, his second grade teacher pulled us aside one time, and she was a Christian, and she really loved us, and she loved him. And she said, make sure that throughout his life, nobody squashes that personality. Wow. And I'm sitting here telling you 24 years later, or whatever it is now, what it was, and those kind of things. And she saw something that we needed to know, and we definitely adhered to. And by the first one being an introvert, second one being an extrovert, we did have to deal differently. So the same parenting style just doesn't always work on children, and in different children. So.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with that more after raising three of my own. And I know Robert has 6 kids in a blended family, that there is a danger in oversimplifying the parenting model. You can read a book or get some great seminar information, take that home with you, and then make the mistake of just believing that if you follow this checklist, voila, at the end of the 10-year period, you have a kid that loves Jesus.
Exactly.
And it doesn't work that way.
Exactly. Yeah.
So the principles are the essentials, and then the application of those principles is an incredibly unique and separate process.
Exactly. And you think about our Father, our Heavenly Father. He does not deal with us exactly the same. Once we begin a relationship with him, he created us, he knows our needs, and he knows what our desires in our heart is, and he disciplines us differently. He never compromises. Like I said earlier, he doesn't compromise ever in his standards, in his principles, in his word, but he customizes things to our needs and what he knows we need, because he's a perfect father. So we ought to take a cue from that, I think.
That's great.
Yeah, one of the things that we had a chance for our audience, one of the things we had a chance to work with Robert on this year is a new curriculum coming out called the Shock and Awe curriculum. And it is for the audience, it's a basic apologetics of Christian belief for preteens and teens. And in that process of sort of writing out the primary points of that study, it was very clear to me that you had a really good grip on how to help kids process doubt. And, for parents in the church, especially a pastor or someone who's a leader in ministry in the church, when your preteen or teen comes to you and they're doubting their faith, that can be an incredibly frightening moment.
Sure.
Yeah.
What would you say to our audience if that's happened to them recently?
Well, first of all, like I said, I've got adult sons in their 20s, and so I wish I would have learned this a long time ago. So if you've got younger children or kids in grade school, whatever, please listen up to this, because this is huge. If you're really desiring to be a Christian parent and raise little Jesuses, little disciples, this is really huge. And I have to give a shout out to my friend and co-writing partner, Randy Frazee, who we wrote the Think, Act, Believe Like Jesus book, because actually the catalyst of this idea came from Randy, and that is this, that our doubts always start in our mind. And whether it's something that we process or the enemy puts in us or or both things together and it mixes up, we start to have a struggle. We start to have a doubt. Like, does God really exist? Is he really real? Is this Jesus stuff right? Is the Bible correct? And all those kind of questions that we are all going to ask, believers or not believers. And what happens is, if we keep those inside our mind and we just don't voice them, we don't let them out, what's going to happen is we keep hearing them, we keep saying them, we keep asking the questions, and then maybe we start to pick up on information that actually supports that doubt. We make a friend, we watch a TV show, whatever, we watch a movie, and we see something that supports that doubt, then we've got more feeding into the doubt. So what happens eventually is that doubt starts to creep out of the mind, slowly down the body, and eventually goes into the heart. Once it sits in the heart for a while, it begins to poison the heart. And the cool thing is that God, in between our minds and our hearts, has put this thing called a release valve that some people call a mouth. And if we will as that doubt creeps down, if we'll let it come out the mouth instead of going in to poison the heart, we have a real opportunity of getting rid of the doubt, maybe solidifying, actually increasing and solidifying and securing our faith. So instead of squelching our kids from saying, oh, don't talk about that, we don't talk about that, we're not equipped for that, let them talk. Just let them say whatever they need to say. And if they discover they can have an open dialogue about their doubts, then I promise they're also going to realize they have an open dialogue about their faith.
Yeah, I'm really encouraged by those comments, because I think there is a significant pressure on people who are pastors or are ministers in the church or a leader of some kind. They're perceived as having their stuff together.
Exactly.
And there's this pressure that our kids should be exemplary, that they're the ones everyone else should look to as the example. And, I really encourage this idea of allowing space in your home for a teen or a preteen to process.
Sure.
The world that we live in, this post-Christian culture, is rabidly critical.
Absolutely.
And so they're going to have to process what we've taught them and determine for themselves if that is going to be for them, if they're going to adopt these beliefs for life. And so the idea of recognizing that this process is normal and healthy is really important for a parent today in the church. What encouragement would you give a parent who's in the middle of that struggle and maybe find themselves caught in fear? Is it going to work out, or are they going to potentially ruin their kid if they allow this?
Well, I think fear in us, particularly as parents, creates one of two things: complete silence or total overcommunication. We either just shut it down, or we eventually freak out and yell, and why do you think this? Why do you believe that? Why are you saying these things? And I think to find a middle ground of just sitting down and saying, hey, look, I want us to begin to learn how to have an open dialogue about faith, about Jesus, about the Bible. And I want you to tell me, what do you believe? What have you come to believe? Don't tell me what you think I want you to believe. What do you believe? Start finding out what your kids think and what they believe. And the only way you're going to do that is to let them have a safe environment to say those things. Now, at first, you may get a blank stare. Is this some kind of trick, or you want to really ground me here, or whatever? But you may have to keep at it. You may have to keep asking the question, but getting them to start talking about it. And the dinner table is a great place to do that after dinner, I think, is after a casual environment like that, to come in and talk about those things. And like, hey, let's begin a dialogue about that. And then don't come back and refute them. Don't come back in that, but begin a conversation. Like, none of us want to just be shut down and go, well, tell me what you really think. Okay, I'm going to tell you what I really think. Well, that's just stupid and wrong, so don't say that anymore. That's very often what can happen, and we can't do that. And I'll tell you, I've made a ton of mistakes in this area, definitely. So I'm not speaking out of an expert point. I'm speaking out of having to learn the hard way. And so now, as opportunities like this come about, I want to share with especially parents and younger parents, like, hey, do things that I wish I would have known.
Right.
And that is an open dialogue with your kids about the Lord. And I'm just telling you, don't be afraid of it. And if you will pray and ask the Holy Spirit, Lord, you know my child's heart, you know my child's mind, you know my child's spirit, you created them. Give me insight into them. Help me understand them. Let them open up. Let your Spirit open me up and open them up. And if you'll pray and give that conversation to the Lord, He's going to come and work in it. He wants to do that.
Right. And I couldn't endorse that more heartily as a pastor.
I have a question. Like, one of the things that you talked about earlier was customizing your approach. Mm-hmm. And so, as a parent that may be sitting around a dinner table with multiple kids, have you found it? There's two ways to look at this. Have you found it more effective to bring it up in a group setting and, like, let's talk about our faith, or individualizing it, like customizing it to that particular person? And the reason I'm asking is that sometimes when you're just one-on-one, you're talking about your faith, it can seem overwhelming for both sides. And so I'm wondering, is it an appropriate approach to maybe bring it up in more of a blanket area, as just so this is something that we can start talking about as a family, and then kind of whittle into individual conversations? Do you have a view on what's the most effective way to make sure you're customizing at the same time, incorporating everybody?
Well, that's a great question. And my answer to that would be, think about a funnel. A funnel is really wide at the top, but when it pours down, it gets really specific where it goes. And I think the same thing applies with parenting. So you've got however many kids you have, 2 to 6 in this room right here. And what you can do is start the open dialogue, the process, very general as a family. Hey, let's talk about this. Hey, what do you guys hear? And what do you think? And just try to get very generalized questions. But then as your children speak, then you can begin to go like, hey, you're putting them to bed at night, or you're in their room and you're hanging out, or you're playing a video game, or whatever it is you're doing. And you go, hey, the other day when we were at dinner and you said this, like, hey, I just want to talk to you a little more about that. Like, you said this, like, what? Tell me more about that. What do you think?
Yeah.
So you do both. You kind of gather it in the general, and then you start getting specific with them in your one-on-one time with them. Now, something I want, it's really, really important here to pick up on, this is probably a whole nother topic here, but if you're going to do the things we've been talking about for the last 20 minutes, you're going to have to decide you're going to be intentional in your parenting. It's going to have a desire, a purpose, and a goal. Because to do these things, you can't be too busy. You're going to have to decide, I'm going to be an intentional parent, and I'm going to go after these things because I want to disciple my kids.
That's great. That's huge.
Yeah, and I think, Robert, your question, Robert Beeson, the idea of sort of creating a third party, the idea of discussing topics without confronting someone is an important distinction, because a parent in fear will want to resolve their fear.
Exactly.
Right. Well, for me, I'm like, oh crap, I haven't talked to Zoe about this. And so, Zoe, what do you think about the fundamental whatever?
You agree with me, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And so a parent will often rush through a process that needs to take time.
Yeah.
And it's for our well-being. It's for our ease of mind. And it's not necessarily best for our child.
Exactly. Yeah, well, you think about how long Jesus was with his disciples, and then he's sitting around a campfire one night, and he goes, hey, I'm hearing what everybody else is saying about me, but who do you guys think I am? You think about that question.
Right, yeah.
After they'd known him for a while, and he waited
and he
to pop
pressing.
that question. Exactly.
Yeah,
and he waited to pop that question, though, until he kind of they had a read on him. He already knew them, of course.
Yeah. Well, that's a wonderful insight, actually, into the gospel. I have the sense that we could talk a long time with Mr. Noland here.
Well, I think we should come back for another episode.
Yeah, I think so. I think we've got a rich bed of topics here, and there's some wisdom, there's some experience here that's very helpful, and so we're going to invite you to tune in for a part 2 of this interview with Robert Noland. And we are grateful for your time, for your focus, for your willingness to listen to this podcast. So God bless you, and tune back in for our part 2.
Parents, remember, even if you may not feel brilliant or brave, you are. For God gave us a spirit not of fear, but of power and love and self-control. And I am not ashamed, for I know whom I have believed. I am convinced that he is able to guard until that day what has been entrusted to me. 2 Timothy 1:7 and 13. This podcast is a service of iShine Ministries and the Tween Gospel Alliance. All rights reserved. Donations to Brilliantly Brave are tax deductible at ishinelive.com. Review and subscribe to this podcast on SoundCloud, Stitcher, iTunes, or on our webpage. And read our blog and connect with us at wordpress@brilliantlybrave.com. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Brilliantly Brave.
Hi, it's Pastor Brad with Brilliantly Brave Parenting, and I am letting you know about a really awesome podcast. If you are a solo parent or you know someone who's solo parenting right now, have I got a podcast for you. Dear friend, co-host of our show, and my partner in crime, Robert Beeson, has started something really spectacular. Robert's here in the studio. Tell us about it.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. So Solo Parent Society podcast is talking to solo parents out there that are doing it alone. We talk to other solo parents that are out there, talk about their struggles and insights that they've come across, as well as experts in the fields that solo parents deal with the most. I was a single parent for 8 years, raising 3 girls. My co-host was a solo parent raising a boy and a girl, also for I think about 7 years. So together we talk about these different topics, and we have great guests, either solo parents, like I said, or experts in the field. So it's new, it's authentic, it's real, it's raw, and it's super fun. Solo Parent Society podcast.
Brilliantly Brave is supporting and encouraging and endorsing what this is, and if you want to check it out, it's available on iTunes?
Yeah, everywhere that Brilliantly Brave is.
Awesome. Thanks.
We're a unique podcast for families of faith, produced by parents and pastors who understand and appreciate how hard it is to maintain your faith in a hostile culture. We're here to encourage and support you in the most vital role of all, parenting. If you're feeling overwhelmed and afraid, it's okay. You're not alone. Brilliantly Brave is hosted by 2 honest and engaging dads with 9 kids between them. A road tripper, author, and pastor, Father Brad Matthias, and iShine founder, solo parenting expert, and all-around foodie, Mr. Robert Beeson. Join us each week as we explore and engage with some of the most intriguing, inspiring, outrageous, and awesome parents in the world. This is Brilliantly Brave.
Hi, and welcome to Brilliantly Brave Parenting. I'm Pastor Brad, your host, along with the amazing sidekick, Mr. Robert Beeson.
That's what I am now.
Yes.
Amazing sidekick.
Amazing sidekick.
Yeah.
Like no other.
Okay, thanks.
2 Batmans, not a Robin. So, what I want to introduce our audience to is an interview that we were able to do with author and pastor Robert Noland. And the conversation went so well in the studio that we decided to do a second part. And so if you haven't heard the first part of this interview with Robert Noland, I encourage you to go back a week, listen to this, and it'll make a lot more sense. If you don't have time for that, you can dive in and catch up with us later. But we want to really get back to the topics at hand. Robert Noland is an author of over 75 books. He's based out of Nashville, Tennessee. He's been a pastor. He has raised 2 kids through adulthood, 2 sons. And we work with Robert in our day jobs, if you will, at iShine. We have collaborated on a couple of curriculums. And so it's through those experiences that we have a friendship with Robert. He's not just an expert or someone that we interview. This is someone that we live around and with. And so the validity of what he's saying is contextualized by the authenticity of his faith. And
those are some big words, Brad.
Let
me just bring that
he's
down
the
to my
real
level.
deal.
That's the thing. I mean, there are experts that you see their books or you see them on TV and you want to have them in the studio because you want to talk to them because they're experts. And then they go home and you don't know, I'm not saying anything bad about them, but you just don't know their life. But we have had the opportunity to get to know Robert, especially me. Robert is the writer with me on the book that I'm working on, Solo Parenting. So I've gotten to know him really well. And then now we've done a couple projects at iShine. We're starting our second one. And the Before 13 things that we're doing a lot of things. So we've had a chance to see Robert and his family up close. And like you said, it's the real deal. I think that sounds better than the contextual authentication of the whatever.
Well, for
doctor.
our audience who don't know,
He's a doctor and he analyzes things like that. That's what happens.
there's a reason we're sidekicks. It's because we're the odd couple of Christian podcasting.
There you go.
So
But enough about us.
Yeah. So we had just been talking with Robert Noland about the significance of doubt and the processing of doubt of our kids, especially the preteen and teenaged child who is working through their faith. They're working through the culture. They're trying to understand what is it they're going to believe, what are they going to reject. And the parent, especially the parent who's a leader in the church, a pastor or someone who's a lay leader of some kind, they have that pressure to get it right, to be the exemplary illustration of Christ to the church. And that pressure is unbelievable within the context of the Christian faith. And so we just really discussed and unpacked the idea of how doubt is a healthy process for all of us to go through.
Yeah, I love what he said about that, just the analogy of the release valve. And you'll have to go back and listen to the first part of this interview to get that. But it's worth doing because I think it's a key component to parenting in a post-Christian era.
I agree. And it's so significant and so important that we're lingering here for a part two. And one of the things, Robert Noland, now I want to introduce you to this audience in part two. Tell them a little bit about where you are on the journey, where you are in parenting.
Well, I have a 26-year-old and a 22-year-old, and so you're still dad and mom, but you have far less input into the decisions. So it's more about just being available. I think that's a huge part of developing your kids into adults is number one, knowing that you're available no matter what. And two, I think the thing that my wife and I have really come to understand since our guys have been in adulthood is the power of prayer. When they're running around and the house is a mess and they're kicking and screaming and there's diapers needs to be changed, it's really hard to find a few minutes to pray other than grabbing your hair and looking up at the sky and yelling, "Help God," But as they get older and they're not in the home as much, and they're out or whatever, you have a real opportunity in that quiet and silence to begin to really learn how to pray for them. And I'm saying you're always going to pray for them throughout their life, but there's something about as they get older and as they begin to move into being less dependent on you, that you can really start to learn how to pray for your child and start doing what you got to do, which is turn them over to the Lord, because they are going to make decisions you don't agree with. They are going to say things you don't like. They're going to make decisions that you wouldn't make. That's God created them to be their own person. You have to allow for that, and you have to say, well, they're not little me's, they're them. And I don't want them to be me. I want them to be Jesus as much as they possibly can, just like I'm working for it. And one of the things we've learned as well in that whole thing is, okay, that is not how we would do it. That is not how we would say it, but there wasn't anything wrong with it. It wasn't bad. It's them filtering it the way they would filter it. So I think the expectations have to change as well of as they become into adults is let them be them as long as it filters through the biblical paradigm you desired for them to have.
Yeah, I love the perspective that you lend to our audience, the looking back a little bit, looking at these preteen and teen years where, frankly, most of the crisis of parenting emerges.
Sure, absolutely.
That 6th, 7th, 8th grade, your kid is getting attitude. And
because they're starting to challenge the dependence.
Absolutely, and that's a norm. We know sort of, intellectually that this is good and healthy for a child to begin to form their own identity. But in the real world, it's a pain in the butt.
Yeah.
Because suddenly now every little thing is a battle.
Sure.
And so one of the topics that we had kicked around in our pre-recording session, you really brought up this concept of understanding really where your kid's at versus where you think or hope they're at.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. Well, I've yet to meet a parent, particularly of a baby to 2 to 3 year old, that didn't think their child was the most perfect, most beautiful child on the planet. And you know what? I think that's a great way to think. I think that's a powerful way to think. I think that somehow we don't understand this, but God looks at each one of us like that. Like, wow, I made him or her, and they're incredible and they're beautiful, and that's a great concept for us to understand. So that's really passed on from God's attitude toward us, is for us to look at our child and think that way. Here's the problem. When they start school and the teacher calls or emails and says, hey, little Johnny was really acting up today. And you start thinking, well, no, they're that perfect little beautiful child that I raised, so that is not possible. So you must be wrong. Certainly there are going to be situations where your child is being falsely accused or whatever, but I've learned that 95% of the time, little Johnny really is acting up and needs attention. And so as they get older and as these things come, sure, you've got to hear them out. Sure, you got to listen. Sure, you got to get all the facts about something. But that has to change from, I love them, they are perfect to me, but you've got to get into reality of what is happening with your child, because what can happen is out of this blind love, we can actually miss huge flaws that our children are developing because we don't want to claim that they're imperfect, because then that makes us look imperfect. And we don't want to do that.
Yeah. I want to jump in here just a little bit. I know Robert and I, we've worked together now going on 8 years. We've sort of raised our kids together,
Yeah,
sure. And I think there's been a healthy discussion between Robert Beeson and myself about, am I missing something?
Yeah, exactly.
Have you ever had that discussion with someone?
Yeah. Sure.
I think that's so healthy. I think the admitting the humility of parenthood is very important to include some other people in the process.
Absolutely.
Robert,
and it's kind of countercultural, because culturally it seems like there are the model parents out there, or they are perceived to be model parents. And so I think this is an overall post-Christian issue, a cultural issue, that we are measuring ourselves constantly by what media is saying, even by sometimes what the church is saying healthy parents are. And so at that point, we don't even want to admit that, man, I've got a son that's dealing with X, or I've got a daughter that's off the rails over here, because it doesn't feel like we have a safe place to do that. And so I do agree that the community, surrounding yourself with people that are godly, that are able to shoulder the questions that we have is critical. And I've appreciated that about being in this setting with you, Brad, is that you can go, man, I just completely freaking blew it. Or I don't know what's going on with my daughter. Like, what the heck? And I've had the same conversations with Robert Noland about my kids. And I find great comfort in that and wisdom. Because it's not really about trying to fix our kids. I mean, that's God working through us, the transformation is going to happen. But a lot of times I feel like we feel the weight of it is up to us to fix our kids and to correct them. And I'm not saying that we don't correct in a disciplinary kind of way, but fix them.
Yeah.
It's not really our job.
Yeah. Yeah, well, we had to do what they're making, but we didn't literally make them, and so God knows them, and that's how he knows how to fix it. Let me just interject this really quick based on what you just said, Robert, is I just want to challenge you, if you're out there listening to this, whatever age your children are, whether they're 2 and you're in a play group, or you're a mom and going to school, or you're a dad in the soccer team, whatever, if you're in a circle of parents where the parents are constantly trying to say, well, did your kid do this? Well, my kid did this. And there's this kind of one-upmanship going on. I would challenge you to find a new set of friends, because that is not reality. If you're in a situation where your kids are little trophies that you're constantly trying to use to compare to how great your life is, especially social media, which is the worst, is it's time to get some new friends. Or if you don't forsake those, then go get some other ones who are in reality, who will say, hey, would you pray for my kid? He's having a problem. Let me pray for you. Though a supportive, not a defensive mode.
And I would add to that, because I think that's incredibly important, is to surround yourself with the right group, is that we know for a fact that everybody across the board is dealing with a lot of these same issues.
Absolutely.
They may cloud it and they may pretend that we've got the perfect little son or daughter, but inside they are scared to death too.
Sure.
Am I messing my kid up? Am I doing the right things? So sometimes it's a good thing for a parent to take the first step and find someone that you feel that there's some kind of, it could be completely undiscussed, but maybe a good approach is to go to them and say, listen, would you mind, how would you feel about getting together, once a month? Because I got to be honest with you, I don't know that I'm doing all the right things in parenting. I could sure use someone to bounce some ideas on. Yeah. I think, talking about release valves in the last episode, I think that would kind of take some pressure off of even the person hearing that. And instead of like playing this, am I better than you? Am I doing this right or wrong? Coming in humility going, I don't know that I got this figured out. Can we just get together and talk? Because maybe you got it all worked out. I can either learn from you, or if you don't feel like you've got it all together, we can at least share the load.
Yeah, I think these are excellent observations, and for our audience, just as a reminder, we are broken, flawed parents, all of us, and so we can't expect our kids to be perfect.
Exactly.
There is an expectation, I think, that if we have faith in Christ and we pray and we go to church and we do the right things, that there's an automatic here. That our kids will convert. Right. And I think we lose sight of the importance of the struggle, not only for the child in determining what they're going to believe for themselves, but also for our faith to grow and to learn how to trust God with something that we cannot control.
Yeah, exactly.
One of the the things that we as parents run out of time for is prayer.
Exactly.
We get through a day, and sometimes it's all we can do to get to the pillow, let alone, pause and pray for our kids. I know you have a passion for prayer, Robert. Tell our audience in the last few minutes that we have, talk to them about the offensive, defensive prayer that you shared with me earlier. Yeah.
Well, first of all, I need to confess that I think in the Christian disciplines, we have strengths and weaknesses. And my wife and I, fortunately, in our gifts, in our spiritual gifts and in our spiritual qualities, we are opposite. And so where I may be strong, she's weaker. And then where she's strong, I'm weaker. And I can just tell you that because of raising a lot of factors I won't go into here, prayer was not a strength for me at all. But it was and is for my wife. And so I've had to learn from her. I have to be challenged from her. I've had to understand that, no, I don't need her to pray less. I need to figure out how to pray more like she does. And so, as we've gotten older, as our guys have gotten older, that prayer has increased and it's changed. And I think the sooner that you and your spouse can carve out, it doesn't matter if you start out for 5 minutes once a week, just be consistent and say, we're going to come together, even if for a few minutes. And if you can do it every day or more than that, awesome. But say, we're going to pray for our children. That's a huge thing that I wish I'd have gotten sooner than I did. And I think that once you do that, your strategy has to be twofold. One is we have to pray offensively and defensively. Now, I think that's a prayer strategy for all of us in all areas. We have to learn how to say, okay, God, here's the things that I'm asking for. Here's the things I want you to do. Here's the things that our desires for our children are, is voice those. Tell him what you want to see in your children. Tell him what you'd like for him to do. Offensively ask that. And then I think the other side is that if we've got to come to the reality, regardless of our spiritual paradigm, that there is an enemy who hates God, and he hates us as Christians, and he certainly hates these little Christians we're raising, and he wants to steal, kill, and destroy them. So we have to pray defensively as well to say, God, protect my child. God, whatever the enemy's plan is, would you thwart it? Would you throw down those weapons? Would you cancel their assignments? Would you stop the enemy from hurting my children? And so you got to put your offense on the field to win, and you got to get your defense on the field to win. And both are very important aspects. And so if you're going to pray for 5 minutes, spend 3 on offense and 2 on defense. Pray for what you want God to do, and then pray against what the enemy is trying to do in your children.
Yeah, I think
that's awesome. And I think, I'm sorry, Brad, I stepped on you there, but one of the key things that you said is doing this together.
Yeah,
absolutely. That's what you're saying. Like,
absolutely.
Even if it's 5 minutes a week,
yeah,
make some time that you and your wife come together and pray.
Sure. Because what's going to happen if you don't pray, you're going to find yourself, when problems arise, you're going to spend lots of times talking about it and sometimes arguing about it. But what if you spent 5 minutes praying about it?
That's good.
Yeah, I think there's a depth of wisdom in that comment that we could go on for a long time. And there are obviously many great books written about prayer and parenting and really engaging with our kids in spiritual warfare. I know for myself and with Robert Beeson that as I have engaged in ministry, as I have stepped into pastoral ministry and worked with iShine Ministries, that the more significant the work that I'm involved with is, the greater the attack on my family.
Absolutely.
Have you noticed that?
Absolutely.
In your life?
Oh my goodness, yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the more influence, the larger the target. That's the way the enemy works. He just wants to stop it. And you may say, well, I'm just a church member. We just go to church on Sunday morning. Hey, it doesn't matter. If your heart as a Christian mom or dad is to raise a Christian child, guess what? You got a target on your back too. You don't have to be a leader.
I think one of the things that you've shared with me, Robert, before is that, and we've talked a little bit about this ministry and how you become a target, is that there are things in my life that I used to do that the enemy had a stronghold in my life that aren't really as much of a stronghold anymore.
Right.
And so if the enemy's not effective at getting me through those things, whether it be a behavior or a thought or some kind of something I'm holding on to, the next thing he does is he goes to those that I love the most.
Absolutely.
And those are our kids.
Absolutely.
And so it's we might have a target because of things that we're doing for the Lord or visions that we have for what God wants to do through us. But we've got to be aware that the next line of attack is coming for our kids. If it's not, if we feel like we're in a healthier place than we ever have been, we've got to be on defense.
Yeah.
With our kids.
Especially in this culture.
Right.
Especially in this culture. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think those insights are incredibly helpful. One of the strategies that I've experienced in the church is that our enemy seeks to separate and isolate. And so as parents, we often will feel intimidated from sharing with those that we go to church with or have a small group or life group with. We sort of keep this stuff to ourselves. So I would encourage our listeners, if you find yourself agreeing or nodding your head as you're listening to us, to reconfirm your commitment to be engaged in your local church. Because the idea of having someone supporting you, someone that you know who can pray with you, that can take that text message in the moment of great doubt or fear and say, hey, let's pray right now. And your spouse and the women or the men in your life that you share your faith with. When you have a community of faith that stands together, I think that's the way God wired us to parent.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, we have to have help in every area of our life. God is a community. He's Father, Son, Holy Spirit. So we're community as well. The more we're in isolation, the more in trouble we usually are. And so being in a community and being in a community of believers, however you come about that is hugely important in every area of our life, and parenting certainly.
Right. Well, I appreciate your time, and it's been a wonderful 2-part podcast that we've had with you, Robert.
Thanks for having me.
I think maybe next year or at the end of this season, we'll probably revisit with you and see what God's been doing in your life and what new projects you're writing.
Awesome.
So,
thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here.
Parents, remember, even if you may not feel brilliant or brave, you are. For God gave us a spirit not of fear, but of power, and love, and self-control. And I am not ashamed, for I know whom I have believed. I am convinced that he is able to guard until that day what has been entrusted to me. 2 Timothy 1:7 and 13. This podcast is a service of iShine Ministries and the Tween Gospel Alliance. All rights reserved. Donations to Brilliantly Brave are tax deductible at ishinelive.com. Review and subscribe to this podcast on SoundCloud, Stitcher, iTunes, or on our webpage. And read our blog and connect with us at wordpress@brilliantlybrave.com. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Brilliantly Brave.
What our kids believe is going to define them for a lifetime. According to George Barna, by the age of 13, what a kid believes is what he'll die believing. For parents and for pastors, that's a frightening experience, especially if you've got an 11 or 12-year-old. At the I Shine Ministries headquarters, this became a huge priority in the last year. We partnered with the Tween Gospel Alliance to bring you a brand new resource known as the Shock and Awe Study Guide. And I'm here with one of the co-founders of this entire program, Robert Beeson. Can you tell us, what is the Shock and Awe Study Guide?
It is awesome. More than that? Yeah. Okay. The Shock and Awe Study Guide is a super cool thing that either a parent can do with their kid, or a youth pastor can do with their students, or a children's pastor can do with their students. And here's the cool thing about it. It is apologetics for kids. So it's the really huge evidence and thoughts of apologetics wrapped in a way that is really tangible and simple for kids to understand, answering 4 primary questions. And they are, what if there's a God? What if the Bible is true? What if Jesus is who he said he was? And what if I'm part of that plan? And we believe if you can answer those 4 questions and you are drawn through evidence proving those 4 questions, that really it's gonna establish a pretty unshakable foundation of faith.
That sounds very helpful, especially if you're a parent or pastor and you're concerned about the condition of your child's faith, what they believe, what the voices of culture are telling them. If that's you and you're interested, go to ishinelive.com and check out in our web store the Shock and Awe Study Guide. It has a digital cloud video base, so it's 4 studies in a small paperback volume for $9, and it has 4 videos that go with 4 studies. It can be done in a weekend, it can be done over a month, or it can be done bi-monthly, however you need it. It is a fantastic resource that I have used as a pastor in my own home church, and I have been impressed. So check it out.
Check it out.